What is the greatest crime in the music industry? Is it selling your soul for fame, or is the real crime refusing to do it? For 30 years, two people have committed that crime every night. Why did Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper reject the hits that were already in place? Why did they fight with producers to retain their raw mountain sound? How could one woman, Wilma Lee, become an unshakable artistic dictator in a man's world? And here's the cruelest question of all. Was their greatest triumph a permanent spot at the Grand Ole Opry, also their commercial death sentence? This is the story of two of the quietest rebels in country music history. The story begins, as so many great country music stories do, in the rugged, isolated heart of Appalachia. Dale Troy Cooper, who the world would come to know as Stoney, was born on October 16, 1918, in the tiny community of Harmon, West Virginia. This was a world defined by two powerful, often conflicting forces: the ancient, seasonal rhythms of farm life and the brutal industrial demands of the coal mine. Life here was measured not by the clock, but by the sun and the mine whistle. It was a dual existence, where a man's hands might plant seeds in the morning and wield a pickaxe in the afternoon. Stoney was the son of Kenny and Stella Cooper, a working-class family whose lives were a testament to the daily struggle for survival in one of America's poorest regions. His father, Kenny, was a man of the land, a farmer scratching a living from the rocky soil, who supplemented his meager income with whatever manual labor he could find: logging, mending fences, working for larger farms. His mother, Stella, was the family's spiritual and musical heart. Her voice was a familiar presence in the local Methodist church, and it filled their simple home with the sound of gospel hymns, melodies that offered hope in the most desperate of times. Stoney was a child of hardship. Born in the aftermath of the First World War, his early years were overshadowed by the creeping economic despair that would soon culminate in the Great Depression. For a boy growing up in Randolph County, the world was not a place of promise, but a series of challenges. Yet even in scarcity, there was music. Music was not a luxury. It was a lifeline, a source of joy and community in a life that offered very little of either. And for young Stoney, it was a natural inheritance. From the age of 6, he was drawn to the fiddle. It was not an exotic instrument, but a part of the fabric of daily life. He learned to play on a battered second-hand instrument, its varnish chipped, but to him it was a treasure. He would spend hours huddled by the family's battery-powered radio, a magical wooden box that brought the world into their living room. He strained to hear the crackling broadcasts from the powerful WWVA station in Wheeling, trying to mimic the soaring notes of master fiddlers. He absorbed the haunting ballads of the Carter family, stories of love, loss, and redemption that seemed woven from the mountain air itself. And he heard a new high-energy sound, a sound that would soon be called bluegrass, coming from a young artist named Bill Monroe. In 1925, tragedy struck. The family lost their farm, a devastating blow that forced them into the ranks of the struggling masses. It was a formative experience for Stoney, instilling in him a deep understanding of life's fragility and a steely determination to overcome adversity. They relied on government work programs like the WPA to put food on the table. Stoney, still a boy, saw the humiliation and fear in his parents' eyes, and he vowed he would never let his own family suffer that fate. Music became his escape and his hope. By the time he was a teenager, he was already a seasoned performer. He didn't just play the instrument. He made the fiddle sing, cry, and dance. He became known locally as a fiddle genius, and along with his brothers, he formed a family band, the Cooper Brothers. They were a popular act at local county fairs, barn dances, and social events, playing lively tunes that set tired feet to stomping and lifted heavy hearts for a few hours. But the crushing reality of the Depression could not be held at bay by a well-played fiddle tune. In 1935, at the age of 17, Stoney made the decision that so many young men of his generation were forced to make. He dropped out of high school and went to work in the coal mines, trading his fiddle bow for a pickaxe to help support his family. It was an immense sacrifice. His days were spent in the darkness of the earth, breathing coal dust, his body aching from the punishing labor, but his soul still belonged to the music. At night, he would wash away the grime, pick up his fiddle, and play in local taverns for a few extra coins. His dream of a life in music was kept alive by the sheer, stubborn power of his will. The darkness of the mine could not extinguish the light within him. The darkness of the mine could not extinguish the light within him. Just a few valleys away, in the town of Valley Head, West Virginia, another remarkable voice was being forged in a very different kind of fire. Wilma Lee Leary was born on February 7, 1921. While she shared Stoney's world of Appalachian poverty, her childhood was defined not by the coal mine, but by the church. Her father was the Reverend Stockley Leary, a respected Methodist minister and a powerful gospel singer in his own right. He was a man of authority whose voice could make a sinner tremble and bring comfort to the grieving. Her mother, Alma, was the matriarch of a performing family gospel group, the Leary family. From her earliest days, Wilma Lee's world was saturated with music, but it was music of a specific and powerful kind, the sacred, soul-stirring sound of mountain gospel. While Stoney was learning the secular tunes of the dance hall, Wilma Lee was learning the harmonies to The Old Rugged Cross and I'll Fly Away. Her family didn't just sing in church on Sundays. They were a professional musical act. They traveled the rugged roads of West Virginia in an old Ford Model A, performing at church services, revivals, and community events. For Wilma Lee, performing was not a choice. It was as fundamental to her existence as breathing. From the age of 4, she was singing with her family, her small, surprisingly powerful voice already showing the promise of the vocal powerhouse she would become. By the time she was a teenager, she was the undisputed star of the group. She possessed a charismatic and commanding stage presence and a voice that was a force of nature. It was not a sweet, delicate, or feminine voice in the traditional sense. It was a strong, clear instrument of authority, the voice of a woman who expected to be heard. It wasn't a whisper, it was thunder. But even for a preacher's family, the Great Depression was a harsh reality. Like Stoney, Wilma Lee was forced to leave school early to work on the family farm. Her days were spent in hard labor, planting, harvesting, tending to livestock. But her nights were spent on the road, singing for the Lord and for her supper. She was being forged into a woman of incredible strength and resilience. Her powerful voice was a direct reflection of her unshakable spirit. She was a pioneer in the making, a woman destined to carve out a place for a strong, authoritative female voice in the male-dominated world of traditional country music. The year is 1936. The place is the Randolph County Fair. It was a collision of two worlds, two currents of the Appalachian musical tradition about to merge into one. On one stage was Stoney Cooper, the fiddler's son, the young man who had traded the darkness of the coal mine for the bright lights of the local music scene. He stood there, fiddle under his chin, playing lightning-fast tunes that made the crowd stomp their feet. On another stage was Wilma Lee Leary, the preacher's daughter, her voice ringing out with the sacred power of the gospel tradition, a sound so pure and strong it cut through the noise of the fair. He was 18, she was 15. They heard each other perform, and in that moment, something clicked. Stoney, accustomed to the softer female vocalists of dance bands, was mesmerized by the sheer unbridled power of Wilma Lee's voice. It was a voice that asked for no permission. Wilma Lee, accustomed to more solemn gospel musicians, was impressed by Stoney's fiery, virtuosic fiddle playing. It was playing that had both technique and soul, but what truly connected them was the sound they made when they sang together afterward, in an impromptu jam session behind the stage. Their voices, one forged in the honky-tonk, the other in the church, blended with a natural, intuitive perfection. It was the sound of the mountains, a harmony that contained both the Saturday night sinner and the Sunday morning saint. It held the sorrow of the ancient ballads and the joy of a resurrection hymn. It was a sound that was whole. They began to perform together, and their musical and personal chemistry was undeniable. The audience felt it. There was an electricity between them, a shared understanding that went beyond the notes on a page. In 1938, they officially formed a duo, and in 1940, they created their own band, a group they christened the Clinch Mountain Clan, a name that proudly proclaimed their deep roots in the Appalachian soil and paid homage to their own pioneers, the Carter family, who hailed from near the Clinch Mountains. They quickly became a sensation on the powerful WWVA Wheeling Jamboree radio show. Their authentic mountain sound a stark and welcome contrast to the smoother, more polished styles that were beginning to emerge. They were not trying to be something they weren't. They were unapologetically and uncompromisingly themselves. In May of 1941, they solidified their partnership in the most profound way possible. Stoney Cooper, the fiddler's son, and Wilma Lee Leary, the preacher's daughter, were married. It was the beginning of a personal and professional union that would last for nearly 4 decades. They were no longer Stoney and Wilma Lee. They had become Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, a single entity, their lives and their music forever intertwined, a perfect harmony found at a dusty county fair. A partnership forged in the mountain soil and sanctified by marriage was now a professional force. The fiddler's son and the preacher's daughter had become a single, undeniable voice. With the mighty WWVA Wheeling Jamboree as their stage, they were poised to conquer the airwaves. But as their star ascended beyond the misty peaks of Appalachia, a new challenge loomed. It wasn't a question of talent, but of identity. In a world of changing tastes and commercial pressures, could their raw, uncompromising sound survive the journey to the heart of the country music machine? Nashville? Their greatest battle was not for fame, but for the very soul of their music. The 1940s were a period of immense growth and consolidation for Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper. While the world was embroiled in the chaos of war, their music became a beacon of stability, a connection to the enduring values of family, faith, and home. A twist of fate played a crucial role in their career trajectory. While many of their male contemporaries like Roy Acuff and Ernest Tubb put their careers on hold for military service or USO tours, Stoney was exempted due to a minor heart condition. It was a fateful turn that allowed their musical momentum to continue uninterrupted at a time when America was most hungry for voices of comfort and authenticity. They became the undisputed stars of the WWVA Wheeling Jamboree. To understand the significance of this, one must understand what the Jamboree was at that time. It wasn't just a radio show, it was a cultural institution. Broadcasting from the Virginia Theater in Wheeling, West Virginia, the Barn Dance Show had a 50,000-watt clear channel signal, a powerhouse that at night could reach nearly every corner of the eastern United States and Canada. Every Saturday night, millions tuned their radios to WWVA to hear the sounds of home. for the countless Appalachian migrants who had moved to northern industrial centers to work in defense plants. The jamboree was a cure for homesickness, a weekly reminder of the hills and hollows they had left behind. And on that stage, Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper reigned. Their live broadcast was appointment listening. They were a comforting, familiar presence during the anxious years of the war and the optimistic boom that followed. Their sound was a potent and unique blend. It had the hard-driving fiddle tunes and the high, lonesome harmonies of traditional bluegrass, a style that Bill Monroe was only just beginning to formalize. But it was anchored by the raw, emotional power of Wilma Lee's gospel-infused vocals. She didn't just sing the notes, she inhabited the story with a conviction that made listeners feel they were living every word. In an era when female country singers were often relegated to the role of the demure girl singer in a male-led band, a pretty presence to sing the gentle love songs, Wilma Lee was a revolutionary figure. She did not stand in anyone's shadow. She was the undisputed leader of the Clinch Mountain Clan. It was her voice that was the centerpiece, her powerful stage presence that commanded the audience's attention. She was not a supporting player. She was the star. She chose the songs, she set the tempo of the show, and she spoke directly to the audience with a natural warmth and authority. But perhaps the most revolutionary part of the Clinch Mountain Clan was not Wilma Lee's power, but Stoney's quiet strength in embracing it. In an era when male band leaders were kings and their egos were often fragile, Stoney Cooper was a man of profound confidence. He saw his wife's brilliance not as a threat, but as the band's greatest asset. He was the master accompanist, the steady hand, the frame that allowed the masterpiece to shine. His willingness to support rather than dominate was not a sign of weakness. It was the ultimate proof of his own artistry and the depth of their partnership. In his own quiet way, Stoney was as much of a pioneer as his wife. Stoney, a brilliant musician and a charismatic performer in his own right, seemed perfectly content in his role as her musical partner and biggest supporter. There was no sign of rivalry or bruised ego. Theirs was a perfect symbiosis. His virtuosic fiddling was the ideal counterpoint to her vocals. His solos were not mere showpieces, but extensions of the emotion in her lyrics. Theirs was a partnership of equals, a progressive dynamic that was decades ahead of its time in the conservative world of country music. In 1948, their rising stardom led to a recording contract with Columbia Records, one of the biggest labels in the business. It was a major milestone. They had conquered the airwaves. Now, it was time to conquer the record charts. They left Wheeling not as regional stars, but as radio titans, ready to take their uncompromising sound to the nation. In the early 1950s, Nashville was a city possessed by a ghost and a dream. The ghost was the image of its own rural past, a past of barn dances, string bands, and a music often dismissed by the wider American culture as unsophisticated, quaint, or, most damningly, hillbilly. The dream was one of relevance, of a future where Nashville could stand shoulder to shoulder with New York and Los Angeles, a capital of culture whose products were not just regional curiosities, but national commodities. The city found itself caught in the throes of a profound identity crisis, a feverish, self-conscious struggle between the very roots that gave it life and the polished veneer it believed was necessary for survival in a modernizing world. This was not merely a matter of civic pride. It was a calculated commercial strategy, a citywide rebranding effort played out in the key of C major. Into this crucible of change, this city of aspiring sophistication, arrived Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper. They did not come seeking to be molded by Nashville's new dream. They came as living, breathing embodiments of its ghost. They carried the unfiltered, unvarnished soul of the mountains in their voices and in the strings of their instruments. Their sound was not an approximation of the Appalachian experience. It was the experience itself, translated into music. It was a raw acoustic force resonant with the echoes of secluded hollers, church revivals, and Saturday night jamborees. It was the sound of wood and gut and horsehair and human lungs pushing air with earnest conviction. This sound, the very sound that had built their career and earned them a fiercely loyal following, was precisely what the new Nashville was trying to sand down, polish, and ultimately hide away. A new era was dawning, an era that would be given a name, the Nashville Sound. It was less a musical genre than it was an industrial formula, a grand experiment in assimilation. The architects of this sound, visionary producers like RCA's Chet Atkins and Decca's Owen Bradley, were not villains in this story. They were pragmatists, responding to the pressures of a changing marketplace. They saw the meteoric rise of pop music and the nascent tremors of rock and roll, and they understood that to compete, country music had to evolve. It had to become more palatable, more accessible to a suburban audience that owned record players but had never set foot in a barn. Their mission was to engineer a new kind of country music, one that could be taken out of the barn and placed comfortably in the suburban living room. The formula was elegant in its simplicity. The jagged edges of the mountain fiddle were smoothed over by the lush cinematic sweep of string arrangements. The percussive, insistent drive of the banjo was replaced by the sophisticated slip note stylings of pianists like Floyd Kramer. The raw, sometimes nasal vocal deliveries that characterized traditional singing were supplanted by smooth, crooning vocals, often backed by angelic pop-influenced choirs. The result was a product that was undeniably country in its lyrical themes, yet sonically aligned with the polished pop records of the day. It was music scrubbed clean of its accent, stripped of its regional dialect, designed for mass consumption. But Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper would have none of it. They were not just performers, they were preservationists. To them, this new sound was not an evolution, but an erasure. They stood as a force of nature against a tide of manufactured polish, a cultural constant in a world obsessed with change. They looked at the formula being perfected in the studios of Music Row and saw not progress, but a profound and tragic misunderstanding of what their music was. Their refusal to compromise was not born of stubbornness, but from a deeply principled stand, a declaration that their very soul was not for sale. The clash was not just likely, it was inevitable, a collision of two fundamentally opposed worldviews. To comprehend the depth of their resolve, one must first understand the chasm that separated their definition of music from that of the Nashville establishment. For the producers and label executives, music was becoming a product, an inventory item to be refined, packaged, and sold. A song's worth was measured by its chart potential, its ability to cross over, its appeal to the widest possible demographic. For Wilma Lee and Stoney, music was something infinitely more elemental. It was the currency of their survival. This was not a poetic metaphor, it was a literal truth. The songs they sang were not crafted in sterile writing rooms by professionals chasing a trend. Their music was the sonic diary of their people, a living archive of struggle and salvation. It was the sound of their parents' prayers in the face of the Great Depression, a time when faith was often the only asset a family had left. A gospel song was not a potential B-side. It was a testament to the resilience that saw them through starvation and uncertainty. It was the sound of a community finding a moment of transcendent joy in a dusty barn dance after a week of back-breaking labor in the coal mines or on the farms. The frantic energy of a fiddle tune was not just entertainment, it was a necessary catharsis, a brief, joyful rebellion against a life of hardship. Their music wasn't written, it was lived. It was forged in the realities of poverty, faith, love, betrayal, and death. It carried the grit of the coal dust and the scent of the pine forests in its very DNA. Therefore, when a producer suggested they smooth out its rough edges, or a label executive asked them to strip away its mountain accent, it was not merely an artistic suggestion. It felt like a demand to be ashamed of their own history. It felt like a command to forget who they were and where they came from. To them, it was an act of profound betrayal, a betrayal of the very people and the very struggles that had forged their identities and given their music its meaning. They were being asked to sell not just their sound, but their soul. Their recording sessions at Columbia's legendary Castle Studio consequently became the stuff of legend, not for the hits they produced, but for the artistic confrontations they embodied. These were not quiet disagreements, they were passionate battles over fundamental principles. One can picture the scene. Wilma Lee, a woman of formidable will and unwavering conviction, standing her ground against a room full of men in suits, arguing not just for a particular arrangement, but for the very integrity of a song's story. Stoney, quieter but no less resolute, would let his fiddle or his guitar do the talking, playing a passage with a raw, emotional honesty that no written chart could ever capture, a sound that spoke of a lineage and a tradition far older than the studio itself. They fought with their producers. They argued with the label executives. Their stance was uncompromising. Nowhere was this conflict more apparent than in their steadfast insistence on recording with their own band, the Clinch Mountain Clan, instead of the slick, highly sought-after session musicians of the Nashville A-Team. In the context of 1950s Nashville, this was no small decision. It was a radical act of defiance. The A-Team was a musical dynasty, a collection of the finest studio musicians, not just in the city but in the world. They were virtuosos like Chet Atkins on guitar, the aforementioned Floyd Kramer on piano, and the versatile Grady Martin who could make a fiddle weep or a guitar sing. These were the musicians who built the Nashville sound, the secret weapon behind countless hits by everyone from Elvis Presley to Patsy Cline. They could walk into a studio, see a chart for the first time, and lay down a flawless track in a single take. They were the epitome of professional perfection. But for Wilma Lee and Stoney, music was never about perfection. It was about feeling. It was about the intangible, unspoken connection between musicians who have shared thousands of hours on stage, in cars, and in cheap motel rooms. The Clinch Mountain Clan didn't just play the notes, they lived the music. They had been forged as a unit on the demanding stage of the WWVA Jamboree in Wheeling, West Virginia. Night after night in front of a live audience, they learned to anticipate each other's every move. They understood the ebb and flow, the push and pull of the tunes, in a way that was intuitive, almost telepathic. The banjo player knew from the slightest change in Stoney's posture that he was about to dig in on his fiddle. The bass player could feel the subtle shift in Wilma Lee's breathing just before she unleashed the full power of her voice. This was a raw, living chemistry, a musical conversation that had been going on for years. Wilma Lee and Stoney believed, with every fiber of their being, that this sacred connection could not be replicated by strangers, no matter how talented those strangers might be. To replace their band would be to perform a heart transplant on their music, replacing a familiar, time-tested organ with a technically perfect but foreign one. The fight extended to the very content of their records. The label, guided by the logic of the market, wanted them to record light, commercial love songs. They pushed for upbeat, non-controversial tunes that could easily find a home on daytime radio, songs that would appeal to the burgeoning teenage market. Wilma Lee and Stoney pushed back with a repertoire drawn from a much deeper, darker, and more complex well of human experience. They brought them songs of sin and salvation, morality plays set to music that grappled with eternal questions of right and wrong. They brought cautionary tales, warning of the dangers of drink and deception, stories that reflected the harsh realities of the communities they came from. They brought fiery gospel hymns that were not gentle reassurances, but powerful soul-shaking calls to repentance. This stubborn, unyielding commitment to their traditional mountain sound and its weighty themes undoubtedly cost them. It likely cost them the kind of massive crossover pop success that some of their peers, like the smooth-voiced Eddie Arnold or the velvet-toned Jim Reeves, achieved. They forsook the path of broader fame and bigger fortunes, but in doing so, it earned them something far more valuable and enduring: a reputation for uncompromising authenticity. In an industry that was increasingly defined by artifice, they were revered as the real deal. They were not actors playing a part. They were a direct, unfiltered voice from the heart of Appalachia, a conduit for a culture and a history that refused to be silenced or sanitized. And the paradox was, their defiance worked. Even as they swam against the current, they were making hit records. In the very period when the Nashville sound was consolidating its power, between 1956 and 1961, they landed 7 singles on the country charts, with 4 of them cracking the highly competitive top 10. These hits were not accidents, they were victories. Each record that climbed the charts was a declaration of their identity, a testament to the fact that there was still a substantial audience hungry for the undiluted truth. Songs like the powerful gospel number "Walking My Lord Up Calvary's Hill" resonated with a deep, abiding faith that was central to the lives of their listeners. The heartbreaking story of the tramp on the street, a somber tale of a fallen woman, spoke to a shared understanding of human frailty and the importance of compassion. The defiant, cheating song "Cheated Out of Love" showcased Wilma Lee's formidable vocal power and a spirit that refused to be a victim. Each hit record was a shot fired in their quiet war, a validation of their struggle, and a powerful message sent back to the executive offices on Music Row. Authenticity was not just an artistic ideal, it was a commercial force to be reckoned with. They were winning the war on their own terms. They had reached the summit, members of the Grand Ole Opry, creators of a sound so pure it had forced Nashville to listen on their terms. By all measures, Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper had won. But no mountain peak is immune to the winds of change. As the 1950s gave way to the seismic cultural shifts of the 1960s, a new sound was sweeping the nation, a sound of rock and roll, of rebellion, and of pop sophistication. Their victory had secured their legacy, but could it secure their future? The question was no longer if they would compromise, but if the world they represented could survive at all. A long, slow fade seemed inevitable, but it would be punctuated by a sudden, heartbreaking silence that no one saw coming. The 1960s were a decade of seismic cultural change. This earthquake not only shook politics and society, but completely reshaped the landscape of popular music. The British invasion, the rise of rock music, and the folk revival all conspired to push traditional country music further to the margins of the popular consciousness. Even within the fortress of Nashville, the trend was towards a slicker, more pop-oriented sound, a conscious effort to shed the hillbilly image and compete on the top 40 charts. For Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, whose music was the very definition of uncompromised tradition. The world was changing around them at a dizzying and unrecognizable pace. They had entered the decade at the height of their powers. As revered members of the Grand Ole Opry, they had a guaranteed spot on country music's most prestigious stage. But outside the hallowed walls of the Ryman Auditorium, the rules were being rewritten. The younger generation, raised on Elvis Presley, was now captivated by the energy of the Rolling Stones and the poetic lyrics of Simon and Garfunkel. To them, stories of tramps on the street and prayers on Calvary's Hill seemed to belong to their parents' world, a world of the past. Yet, there was a profound irony in this era. While rock and roll dominated the airwaves, the folk revival rose up, championing authenticity and folkloric roots. Young artists in Greenwich Village were rediscovering the very ancient ballads and Appalachian tunes that Wilma Lee Stoney had lived and breathed since birth. Suddenly, they found themselves embraced by a new, younger, more academic audience, who saw them not as country stars but as authentic folk artists. The irony was profound. While Nashville producers tried to wash the hillbilly sound from their records, a new generation of young, educated folk singers was desperately searching for it. The same songs Nashville deemed too old-fashioned were now met with scholarly reverence from crowds of college students sitting cross-legged on the grass at festivals like Newport. To these young artists, Wilma Lee's voice wasn't a relic. It was a primary source, a living library of the American soul they were trying to rediscover. The rebels Nashville tried to tame had become the heroes of a cultural revolution. They were invited to play prestigious folk festivals, like the Newport Folk Festival, sharing the stage with the likes of Joan Baez and Pete Seeger. To this audience, Wilma Lee Stoney were living pieces of American musical history, a direct connection to the deep roots of the songs the young folk artists were reinterpreting. This opened a new chapter in their career, taking them off the circuit of county fairs and southern auditoriums and onto college campuses and concert halls around the world. They toured internationally, bringing their authentic mountain music to audiences in Europe and beyond, who received them with an almost scholarly reverence. But this new role as cultural preservationists also meant they were increasingly pushed from the commercial country mainstream. They continued to be a beloved and constant presence at the Grand Ole Opry, revered by their peers and adored by their loyal fan base. They continued to record a string of powerful albums for Hickory and later Decca Records, and scored occasional hits, like the classic story song Philadelphia Lawyer. But their days as consistent contemporary hitmakers were over. They were no longer stars. They were becoming legends, living symbols of a sound and a tradition that seemed to be fading away. Their role now was that of ambassadors, of keepers of the flame. They were a living, breathing reminder of the deep, powerful roots of country music, a reminder that before the strings and sequined suits there was a fiddle and an honest voice. But time and a lifetime on the road were beginning to take their toll. Nearly 4 decades of relentless performing, the long nights on 2-lane highways, the meals in roadside diners, the thousands of times setting up and tearing down equipment had left their mark. Stoney's health in particular began to decline. The minor heart condition that had kept him out of the war decades earlier had developed into a more serious ailment. The fiery fiddler's energy began to wane. Their performance became a testament not just to music, but to their unbreakable bond. The audience saw the same fiery fiddler, but the band and those watching closely saw the subtle signs. They saw how Wilma Lee might hold a note a little longer, her powerful voice filling the space to give Stoney a moment to catch his breath. They saw a knowing glance that communicated everything without a word. She was no longer just his musical partner. She was his anchor on stage, her strength becoming his. Their music was no longer just about Saturday night joy and Sunday morning faith. It was now a quiet, courageous symphony of love and devotion against the slow march of time. For a man like Stoney Cooper, whose music and vitality were so inextricably linked, physical decline was a devastating blow. His fiddle had always been an extension of himself, a vessel for unleashing a seemingly boundless energy. Now his body was beginning to betray his spirit. It became more of an effort to keep up with the pace of the shows. His solos might be a little shorter, his stage steps a little less boisterous, but he never let it compromise the performance. His dignity and professionalism would not allow it. Wilma Lee became his caretaker and protector, as well as his wife and musical partner. She watched his health carefully, ensuring he took his medication, making sure he got enough rest. On stage, she would carry more of the load, filling any gaps with the sheer force of her voice and presence. Their partnership, always strong, was now deepened by a new fragility. They had faced poverty, war, and changing musical taste together. Now they were facing the inescapable enemy of time. Still, they carried on. The Grand Ole Opry was their home, their sanctuary. Every weekend, they would step onto that stage, and for a few precious minutes, they were the young king and queen of Wheeling all over again. The Opry audience, who had grown up with their music, still greeted them with boundless love and respect. They were part of the very fabric of the show, an unbreakable thread connecting its present to its golden past. And then, on a March day in 1977, the unthinkable happened. On March 22nd, Stoney Cooper, the quiet, steady man who had stood by Wilma Lee's side for nearly 40 years, whose fiddle was the second voice in their musical dialogue, suffered a sudden and fatal heart attack. He was just 58 years old. There was no warning, no long goodbye. In an instant, the partnership that had defined their lives and left an indelible mark on country music was over. The harmony was silenced. The fiddle fell quiet. For Wilma Lee, it wasn't just the loss of a husband. It was the silencing of half of her soul. The world of traditional country music had lost one of its most faithful sons. And a great story, which seemed as if it would last forever, had come to an abrupt, painful end. And just like that, the music stopped. The harmony that had defined their lives for nearly 40 years was silenced by a single final heartbeat. The partnership was over. For the world of country music, it was the end of an era. But for Wilma Lee Cooper, it was the end of a world. Many assumed the story was finished, that the voice of the mountains would fade into a grief-stricken silence. But they underestimated the strength of the woman who had always been the anchor of that sound. The greatest test of her life was not found on any stage, but in the crushing quiet that followed. Could the First Lady of Bluegrass stand alone? And what would her voice sound like now that it was haunted by the echo of an unbearable loss? Death never arrives gently, but the death of Stoney Cooper was like a sudden earthquake that shook the very foundations of the traditional country music world. The news spread through the halls of the Grand Ole Opry, over the radio airwaves, and in pained whispers among musicians, leaving a stunned silence in its wake. For nearly 40 years, the name Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper had been a single entity, a constant in the musical universe. Now half of that equation was gone forever, leaving a void that could never be filled. At the Opry, the grief was tangible. Stoney wasn't just a performer. He was family, a friend, a mentor. The giants of the industry, Roy Acuff, Minnie Pearl, Ernest Tubb, publicly mourned their loss. They weren't just mourning a great fiddler. They were mourning the end of an era. The partnership of Wilma Lee and Stoney was a symbol of endurance, a reminder of a time when music was built on trust and love, not contracts and charts. With Stoney's passing, a piece of the Opry's soul seemed to die with him, but the community's grief could not compare to the private abyss Wilma Lee Cooper now faced. She had lost her partner since she was a teenager. She had lost her confidant, the father of their daughter, Carol Lee, and the only person in the world who understood the wordless musical language that passed between them. In their home, the silence of Stoney's fiddle must have been a scream. Every corner of the house, every familiar road, every stage they had ever shared was now a painful reminder of what was gone. To the outside world, the question wasn't what Wilma Lee would do next, but if she could do anything next. She was 56 years old. She was a widow. In an industry already unkind to women as they aged, many assumed her career, like their partnership, was over. The common assumption was that she would quietly retire, living on the memory of past glories, that the story of the Clinch Mountain Clan was finally at an end. One could no more imagine Wilma Lee without Stoney than one could imagine day without night. They had underestimated the strength of the preacher's daughter from Valley Head, a strength forged in the lean years of the Depression, honed on 1,000 dusty stages, and anchored by an unshakable faith. Wilma Lee Cooper may have lost her partner, but she had not lost her voice, and she had not lost her will. After a period of profound grief, she made a decision that would not only shape the rest of her life, but would cement her legacy forever. She would go back. Her return to the Opry stage was one of the most courageous and moving moments in country music history. It was not a performance. It was an act of faith and resilience. When she began to sing, the voice was still there, strong, clear, and unmistakable. But there was something else in it now. It was colored by loss, deepened by pain. Each note carried a new weight, a heartbreaking resonance. The old songs took on a new haunting meaning. The gospel hymns of faith and redemption were now sung with the authority of a woman who had known profound loss and still found the strength to go on. The story songs of tragedy and heartbreak were no longer just stories. They were testimony. Her voice, always powerful, now carried the unmistakable weight of lived experience. The audience sat mesmerized, many of them in tears, witnessing not just a musical performance, but a triumph of the human spirit. She didn't just return to the stage, she took full command of the Clinch Mountain Clan. The band was hers now, and she led it with a new authority and confidence. She proved to all the doubters that she had not been merely one half of a duo. She was a force in her own right. She had stepped out of the shadow of a legendary partnership to stand in her own light, and that light was as brilliant as ever. She became in her own right an icon. The title the First Lady of Bluegrass was no longer just an honorific. It was an undisputed fact. She had earned it through decades of uncompromising artistry, and now through her refusal to be silenced by grief. The years after Stoney's death were not a slow fade for Wilma Lee Cooper. They were a vibrant new chapter. She found a new home and a new audience in the burgeoning world of bluegrass festivals. While mainstream country radio drifted ever further toward the pop sounds of the urban cowboy era, the bluegrass festivals became a haven for purists, for those who craved the authentic, unadulterated sound. To them, Wilma Lee was not a relic. She was their reigning queen. She toured tirelessly for the next 2 decades, a beloved and revered elder stateswoman and a guardian of traditional mountain music. She was a living bridge connecting the pioneering generation of the 40s and 50s to the neo-traditionalist movement of the 80s and 90s. Young artists like Ricky Skaggs, The Whites, and Alison Krauss, who were trying to bring acoustic sounds back to country music, all looked to her as a hero, an inspiration. They owed a debt to the woman who had proven that a female voice could be the most powerful instrument in the band. But time, as it had with Stoney, finally began to catch up with her. Her health began to fail in her later years. Her career came to an abrupt end in 2001 when she suffered a debilitating stroke while performing on the Grand Ole Opry stage. It robbed her of some of the power of the voice that had defined her life, forcing her to do the unthinkable, retire. The music world grew a little quieter, but the honors were not yet finished. In 2002, she received the National Heritage Fellowship from the National Endowment for the Arts, a recognition of her lifetime of contributions to America's cultural legacy. Wilma Lee Cooper passed away on September 13, 2011, at the age of 90. The unbroken voice of the mountains was finally silent. The voice that had rung out from the heart of Appalachia for nearly a century was finally silent. The life story of Wilma Lee Cooper and the partnership that defined it had come to its natural end. But the end of a life is not the end of a legacy. A voice so powerful does not simply disappear, it echoes. It travels through time, influencing artists yet to be born and finding new audiences in a world she never knew. To truly understand the story of Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper, we must now look beyond their lives and listen for those echoes. What was the unique DNA of their sound? Who carries their torch today? And how does their uncompromising spirit continue to resonate in the digital age? The authenticity of Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper's music was not an abstract concept, but the result of a specific formula. Stoney's raw, blues-inflected fiddle, Wilma Lee's powerful and authoritative high lonesome voice, and her strong rhythm guitar playing. This combination created an unmistakably honest sound. Their legacy is most clearly seen through the generations of artists who followed. They paved the way for strong women like Loretta Lynn, were admired by musical preservationists like Emmylou Harris, and became heroes to the neo-traditionalist movement of the 1980s. Today, their spirit lives on in contemporary artists who also pursue authenticity over pop uniformity. While technology like YouTube and streaming services has introduced their music to a new generation of listeners, their story can be seen as a parable of the mountain versus the machine. The mountain represented their authentic culture, rooted in real life. The machine was the Nashville music industry, seeking profit and commercial formulas. Wilma Lee and Stoney consistently rejected the machine, refusing to compromise for mainstream fame. Their failure to become pop stars was their greatest triumph, as it allowed them to preserve an authentic musical legacy that has outlasted many commercial hits of the era. Therefore, listening to their music today isn't just hearing old music. We are connecting with enduring values, resilience, faith, and community. We are hearing the story of a woman who refused to be defined by anyone but herself. Ultimately, the story of Wilma Lee and Stoney Cooper is the ultimate testament to a profound idea. True success isn't measured by fame or wealth, but by integrity, the ability to go through life without losing who you are. By that standard, they were among the most successful artists. Their circle of tradition remains unbroken,